He's literally in the spotlight. It's pretty bright up here. But. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for being with us on this perfectly beautiful fall day. It'll still be out there when we're done, so don't worry. And those of you who are recording the Giants, we promise we won't tell you what the score is if someone mentions it. My name is Glenda Gephardt. I'm the Executive Director at the Schuyler County Historical Society, and we are hosting this talk today in conjunction with our current exhibit honoring the Italian founders of Schuyler County. The exhibit opened, I think it was around early September, and it's been a huge success since it opened. But to be honest, it was a success before it opened because of all of you and the others in the community who aren't with us today, who participated in putting that exhibit together. We put the word out that we were going to do it, but we needed your help. And you all answered with information and photographs. And we're now able to honor 60-some folks. It's not everybody, unfortunately, but man, it's some of the key folks who were here in the earliest days, and it's so exciting. I've seen people stand in front of those photographs and laugh and tell each other stories. I've seen people stand in that room and cry. It's been just very, very powerful. And to have our speaker here today to add to it, it's just really exciting, and I'm so glad you're here with us. Our speaker is indeed this man to my left, a Watkins Glen historian, and I now turn the microphone over to him. Thank you.
Mi chiama Vincenzo Giuseppe Scappatura. Sono figlia di Niccolo Scappatura e Francesca Criazzi. Those of you who understand Italian, I'm sure you know what I said. My name is James Joseph Scaptura in English, and I am the son of Nicholas and Francis Scaptura. Now, one of the great traditions of people of Italian descent is to name their children after somebody in the family. And I'm no different than anyone else. I'm named after someone in my family. But there is a story that goes along with it, if you don't mind me telling it, because it's an example of this tradition of family naming. Now, a lot of people have asked me, that thing drives me nuts.
You have to use it though.
Do I?
Yes. Sorry.
A lot of people ask me about the name Vincenzo. How do you translate Vincenzo into James? Well, you don't have to ask, because that's right. Everyone that I knew, that I know, of Italian descent, named James, is also called Vincenzo. In the area that I grew up in, Watkins Glen, nobody called me Jim or James. It was always Vincenzo. And my family, I had family also in Auburn. My mother was from Auburn, New York, so I had a large family over there. And over there I was Vincenzino, which is Little Jim. And no matter how old I got, I was still Little Jim because I had an uncle also named Vincenzo Giuseppe, and so I was always Little Jim, or Little Vincenzino. In fact, I can still hear my grandmother when she wanted me, Vincenzino, Vincenzino, vieni qua. Anyway, Before I was born, the tradition in our family, and you think about, I use this just as an example, but the tradition in our family was that the oldest son of the oldest son was to be named after his grandfather, that'd be my father's father. My grandfather's name was Rocco. My mother informed my father that under no circumstances was I going to be forced to go around with the name of Rocco. So they decided on Nicholas, which was satisfactory to everybody, including my grandfather, to be named after my father. But then my father, who worked up at the Glen Springs, had a religious experience. After he finished work, he always walked down Vault Hill. Now, some of you may know that as Pine Street, but those of us who grew up here, it's Vault Hill. And walking home one day, he said he heard his grandfather talking to him. And his grandfather said, Nicky, remember, you promised me you would name your oldest son after me. And so that's how I got the name Vincenzo. I am named after Vincenzo Campisi. And he was here before the rest of the family. In fact, he came before the turn of the century, before the turn of the 20th century. And he made a living as a horse trader and very often acted as a patron, as a sponsor for people to come to the United States for whatever reason. So the question is, where did these people all come from? Why did they come here? And what did they do after they got here? Well, most of the people in this area came from Italy, south of Naples. Now, if you look at the map in the museum, you'll notice that the Italian peninsula is pretty well covered. But most of the people in this area came from south of Naples. The reason for that is because that part of the country was very poor. It was shortly after what was known as Risorgimento, or the unification of Italy. And most of the effort, wealth, power, went to the northern part of Italy. The southern part remained rural and agricultural. It still is pretty much today rural and agricultural. Because of the difficulties, because of the increase in population, because of the lack of land, because it was very hard to find a job, many of those people wanted to come to the United States for various reasons. Many of them just to come here for a better life. Many of them wanted to come here to make money to go back to Italy to buy land. In fact, my grandfather Schuyler, that was his intent when he came here. He was the second child. His family owned fig groves, and because he was the second son, he inherited nothing. And so his idea was to come here, make money, go back and buy land and be a farmer. Of course, other things got in his way, and he never went back. My grandfather from Auburn, he came from a different class. He was upper middle class. Came from a merchant family. And he came here for a whole different reason. He fell in love with a peasant girl, which was unusual in those days because usually marriages were arranged. But he fell in love with a peasant girl, and his family disowned him, so he said, well, that's fine, I'll go to America and make my own fortune. So when he arrived, he had no intention of going back. So it's southern Italy that these people mostly came from. Naples, people from Naples and Napolitan, Abruzzes, Calabria, Calabrese. In fact, in the area that we live in here, probably the greatest portion of them came from Calabria. And within that province, the village of Sinopoli, a large number of them came from the little village of Sinopoli, which is almost down at the toe of the peninsula, probably maybe 10 miles from the city of Reggio, which is the major city right at the toe of the peninsula. There were actually two little villages. The other village there was Santa Fania, which was, it would be like Watkins Glen and Montour. And my other grandfather came from Santa Fania, which was kind of a little, I hesitate to use the wealthier district, but it was only about 3 or 4 miles away. And so there was a connection. My grandfather, great-grandfather, Vincenzo, was also from Sinopoli, so that was the connection for the people of that area to come to Watkins Glen. Now, there is something that I have to mention about being Calabrese. For those of you who, I'm sure many of you know what this is, but when I was a little boy, and I spent a great deal of time in the area where the Italians settled. And walking around, if I happened to run into somebody, they'd ask me my name, and I would tell them. They'd ask me who my father was, and I would tell them. And then the next thing that would come out of their mouth is, "Oh, you're Calabrese." 8-year-old kid, I know what the heck that meant. But I asked my mother. She says, "Oh yes," she says, "Calabrese, Capadost, hardheads." What they don't tell you about that is the rest of it. There's another part to it. Nobody ever mentions the other part. Calabrese are hardheads, and that's probably true. I have a lot of examples of that. But the other part is warm heart. They never tell you that part. Hard heads, warm heart. Deb, you remember that?
Absolutely.
I can't see you. Anyway, they came here principally because they needed a job. And what was available to them, and you talk to most of the immigrants that came here at that period, what was available to them was the Lehigh Valley Railroad needed workers. And so they came here to help build the railroad, which was good. But what happens after they finish? What do you do then? Well, most of them found that they could do something here and began looking for other opportunities. And they were available, but these folks had to, I hesitate to use the word create the opportunity, but basically that's what they had to do. They were in a country, they didn't speak the language well. A lot of the people who were here weren't particularly happy to have them here. Many of the people who already lived in Watkins Glen were afraid that they were going to take away their jobs. And so there wasn't a great deal of acceptance right at the beginning. But they found a way. Fortunately, right in the early part of the 20th century, 2 salt companies were just beginning to operate, and so that provided jobs for many of them. A lot of them became barbers. A number of them became shoemakers. Also grocers. And well, there was something else up there. It's gone, but anyway, those were some of the areas that that these people found that they could earn a living, and we were quite successful at it. That was the generation that were the immigrants, and they had to work very hard, provide for their family. The second generation, they were able to use what their immigrant parents had established for them and expand, so that you had a number of very successful businesses and professional people coming out of that second generation. And I would use the example of Glenn Chevrolet, for instance, or Johnny Frank's clothes shop, Fraboni's grocery store. My father had a grocery store. They were all that second generation, and it was that first generation that provided them with a basis to be able to accomplish those things. Most of the people in that first generation, most of them didn't get a full education. For instance, my father had to quit school at 8th grade. His brother also, Brother Frank, they had to quit school in 8th grade so that they could help bring money into the family. Later on, some of the members of that generation were able to go to college. And my generation, that was almost mandatory. In fact, from the time I can remember, my father, my mother, and my grandparents as well, because you had to go to college, and there was just no question. Didn't care where you went, you had to go. So it was that generation, that first generation, that laid the groundwork for all of that. Now, not everybody around here was crazy about those people. Now, it's been a long time since anybody has called me a greasy wop. But it happened quite frequently when I was growing up. The Italian immigrants in Watkins Glen lived from Decatur Street to McGee Street, from about 8th Street over to about 12th Street, in that area. Now there were Spanish. There was a number of them up in on the Salt Point Road and scattered throughout the village, but for the most part they were concentrated in that area. And I can recall more than one occasion being somewheres other than in that area and being told by someone, why don't I go back to 10th Street where I belonged? Well, of course, I really didn't pay much attention to it. I that was just part of the deal. Most of my friends were of Italian extraction or Irish, either one. We did have an honorary Protestant, if you don't mind. He was a member of our group. We turned him into a good Italian. But anyway, it lasted for quite a while. I can remember going through high school, I can remember running into the problem frequently enough. It was worse, though, before I came on the scene. And I can remember my father and my uncles and their friends telling me about the Ku Klux Klan operating in the area. They were big in Elmira, and they were around here as well, and in the 1920s. And they used to burn crosses up on the hill. Well, that lasted for a while, but some of the young men of Italian extraction really didn't put up with a lot of it. And there were several of them that you didn't want to call them a greasy wop, because the next thing you would find was your mouth full of his fist. Now, that probably wasn't the way to solve the problem, but sometimes that's how they did it. It didn't stop it completely. There was among the first generation immigrants the feeling that they had to be American. In fact, I dislike the term Italian American. I'm an American. I was born here. And I don't care to be called an Italian American. Now, that said, I am extremely proud of my Italian heritage. But I am an American, period. And that business, Anglo-American or African-American, that just tends to divide us, and it's not particularly good. But those people had to deal with it. I can remember when my father went to school, they sat him in the back of the room because he smelled of garlic, and they changed his name. Our name is Scapatura, not Scapatura, but they took the PA out, and so it stuck. When I was in Italy, not too long ago, and I told them my name, and the guy in the hotel said, no, Scapatura. There's a lot of Scapaturas in Italy, but we thought it was such an unusual name, but it's not. It's a form of Smith. So, as far as we can find out, it actually is a form of Smith. Armor maker or something. It had something to do with armor making, and how they got the name is beyond me. But anyway, the immigrant Italian ladies would come into my father's store, and they'd start talking to him in Italian. And my father could talk Italian as well as anybody. But in my entire life, I never heard him speak Italian. My mother, on the other hand, she loved it, especially when my aunts were around, and they didn't want anybody else to know what they were talking about. Big thing right into Italian, nothing to it. And that's one of the great unfortunate things about my generation, is that we are not bilingual. I should be able to speak Italian as well as anybody. I can manage about the level of a 2-year-old. When I was little, to get along, you either had to speak it and understand it, or you didn't get anything to eat. But anyway, they'd come into the store and they'd start talking to him in Italian. He'd say, no, 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 only English, only English. And so that was that effort to Americanize everybody. You know, that second generation, actually the first generation after the immigrants, they're the ones that, boy, they got hit hard. They got hit with the Depression, and then they got hit with a World War. And they had to take care of both things. And if you go down to the courthouse and look at the plaque, you will find quite a number of young Italian men, young men of Italian descent, who fought in World War II and who never came back. And several of them in Italy, trying to liberate the country of their parents. So that every once in a while, I'll run into somebody who will say something derogatory about people of Italian descent, but not too frequently anymore. That's pretty much disappeared. So I had grandparents in two different places. So I got to experience Italian immigration from two different points of view, from Watkins Glen, and then also in Auburn. And there were, of course, a lot of similarities, but there were also some major differences. For instance, in Auburn, very rarely did I run into being called a wop. It didn't happen that frequently over there. In fact, almost never. I'm not sure just why, but it just didn't seem to happen as frequently. My grandparents over there, there was a difference. My grandparents over there were very wealthy. My grandfather, when he came to this country, started with a pushcart and built up a large produce business. And he died a young man. He was only 50 years old. But one day, my mother took me out and showed me all the property that he owned. And he owned a large building, which was the center of his business. He owned he had his own siding in the New York Central Railroad. He had a huge warehouse there, a theater, 2 grocery stores, a nightclub, and a farm. So he was a fairly powerful individual. In fact, maybe the description would be he was the godfather. Now, I often asked how he made his money. My mother said he made it by building up his produce business. Somebody else told me he was a bootlegger. Well, I couldn't prove that one way or the other, but at one time he owned 3 Pierce Arrows. Now I don't know if you know, a Pierce Arrow is roughly the equivalent of a Rolls Royce. And so he couldn't drive, but he had 3 sons that could. So, and every time Enrico Caruso came to New York City, every time he went there to see him. So, anyway, There's just a couple of little stories, if you don't mind, about that, so just to demonstrate his influence, I guess. My grandmother was a typical little old Italian lady. After my grandfather died, wore black, her hair, white hair, pulled in a bun. And whenever she went downtown, if I was in Auburn, and we lived there when my father was in the Army, we lived there for a year. Whenever she went downtown, I had to take her. Now my grandmother could have afforded a taxi. She had several cars there and daughters that could have taken her. She could have bought the taxi company if she wanted, but she had to walk. So we walked down, and one day we went down, and we went into the big store. Now the big store was Auburn's equivalent of Izard's. And she had forgotten her pocketbook. And we were looking around, and she found a hat she wanted. And so she picked it up, took it over to the clerk, and said, in broken English, "I'd like to buy this, I'd like to take this, I'll take it home, and I'll send my daughter right down with the money." And the clerk said, "Oh, no, we can't do that, can't do that." And she kept that, and the clerk just said, the manager of the store was up in his office and heard the whole thing. He came running down, and he says, "Oh, Mrs. Criazzo, don't worry about a thing. You take the hat, bring the money whenever you please. I remember your husband." So, when I was a little boy, I liked to build airplanes. I still like to build airplanes. And in their building, my mother would make me sit out in the hall to build them for whatever reason. And so on Saturdays, I would be sitting out there, and there would be a line of people coming up the stairs into the hall, waiting to see my grandmother. And she was almost like holding court. And they would come in one at a time and ask her for a favor, money, or if they were having a problem with their street or something, and she'd tell me, my uncle, "You go tell so-and-so to fix that down there." And it would be fixed. So, in the building, it was a good-sized building. It's still there today. It doesn't look like it did then, but it's still there. But there were banana sellers, and put all the bananas in. When the bananas came, we'd have to take them down, put them in the banana sellers. But way in the back of the banana sellers, there were two doors. And they went into two more rooms. And then there were two more doors and two more rooms. And I asked, what were those rooms for? But I never got an answer. So, you know. So anyway, in Watkins Glen, it was a different atmosphere. There was much more association, I think, between the people. There was always a lot going on. And you have to remember, when I was growing up, there was no television. And so what was important to these people were the radio and the Victrola. And everybody had one, of course. We didn't have a telephone, I think, until like 1947. If you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to go. You couldn't just pick up the telephone and call them up. You had to go see them, which was probably better. Not the immigrant, well, partially the immigrant generation, but that first generation. There were, in those homes, this was the order of importance. God, the Blessed Mother, St. Anthony, Sant'Antonio, Joe DiMaggio, and Frank Sinatra. And if you think I'm kidding, they were like sainthood, those two guys. Now, don't take anything away from them, either of them, because they did a lot. Those two people did a lot to break down the barriers. And of course, there may be some people in here old enough who were in love with Frank Sinatra. My mother and my aunts were all in love with him. And it was like he was part of the family. They didn't, it wasn't, well, where's Frank today? Or what's Frank doing? It's like he was, you know. He is, without question, the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. Now, I don't know if anybody would want to argue with me over that one, but I would argue, no question about it. The greatest entertainer of the 20th century. The other one was Joe DiMaggio, and he did a lot to break down. And now, we didn't like being called a wop. We didn't like being called a guinea. But the Dago didn't bother us. I don't know, for whatever reason. In fact, DiMaggio was referred to by his own team members as the Big Dago. And my father, Italian bread, he called it Dago bread. And my grandfather, the wine that he made himself, he called Dago wine. Dago bread. So that didn't seem to bother him, they took my grandfather to see Joe DiMaggio. And holy, that's all they talked about. And the next year, and of course, listening to all that, and, so the next year my Uncle Jimmy took me to see Joe DiMaggio. So I got to see both of those people in person, both Joe DiMaggio and Frank Sinatra. I could go on about Sinatra. He's unquestionably the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. When we went down to Binghamton to see him, and when that man walked into that arena, nobody could see him, but he had that arena just like that. And for the rest of the time, he had that crowd right in his hand. I've seen other entertainers, but no one able to do what that man did. And of course, his voice. I've never heard anybody before or after him to compare. But anyway, so quite frequently, we'd go from house to house. My mother liked to visit. She especially liked going to Peter Frank's because her best friend was Catherine Frank, so she loved going there. Well, I did too. And the reason why I like going there is because Mrs. Frank made the best bread you could ever imagine. And whenever I went there, she would get out a loaf of bread for me, and she'd cut it up, put some butter on it, and then I'd sit inside of her cupboard so that nobody would take my bread away from me. But I had a wonderful time there. I also spent a lot of time, Anna Jean is here, I spent a lot of time at Anna Jean's grandparents, which was next door. It was up the street, and I loved going there because Mrs. Skimmers always had something delicious to eat. That's the other thing about growing up in this immigrant Italian environment. You can't believe the food, except that those of you who were there know what I'm talking about. I didn't know my grandmother Scamptura very well because she died when I was only 7, so I never got much opportunity, but she taught her daughters very well how to cook. My mother was an excellent cook. My father was a better cook than my mother, but anyway, my grandmother Piazza was a superb cook, and anything those people made just indescribable. And so almost no matter where I went in that area, whoever, if I was walking around, if they happened to be outside, Vincenz, vieni qua, and I'd get something to eat. Sometimes sausage and peppers, other times Italian cookies, and it was really, really very nice to be able to do that. And it was very nice because everybody knew who I was. The other part of that, of course, was everybody knew who I was, and I could. It was like having a whole neighborhood full of uncles. Now, there's another thing. I had in Auburn, I had 3 uncles and 5 aunts, 4 aunts, 5 aunts. And here I had 3 aunts and 5 uncles. My uncles, one day, my youngest uncle, Uncle Dickie, was only 11 years older than me. So I had a pretty good relationship because of his age. And his nickname was Rabbit. And one day, I was about 12 years old, 13 years old maybe, and I called him Rabbit. And my father heard me. And he grabbed me and he says, "Don't you ever, ever hear me, let me hear you call your uncles by anything other than uncle." Never did again. Never again. I always gave, well, actually, it was like having, I had more than one father. They were all my father. My aunts and uncles all had absolute authority over me. And unquestionably. If I didn't do what they had the authority to punish me. So it was easier just to do whatever they wanted. In back of Skimmitz's house was a large barn. And just about this time of year, Mr. Skimmitz would get all the apples, and he had an apple press and a cider press. And for several days during this time of year, he would make cider, and the whole neighborhood would go over for that activity. And you could, and invariably somebody would bring the donuts, and great cider. Anna Jean, do you remember that? Sure. Across the street, Marjoleen's lived, and I liked going over there. But one day I went over, and they were killing sheep. And they were slitting their throat. And they had them hanging up by their hind feet, and they slit their throat and let the blood come out. and you'd hear all this buying and everything. I didn't hang around too long for that one. Almost everybody had animals when I was little. My grandfather had chickens. The gentleman across the street had a goat. There was a pigsty that belonged to the Skimmets just up the creek a little ways. Almost everybody had some kind of animals until I think around 1945. I think the village passed a ordinance that you couldn't do that anymore, and so they all disappeared. But I can remember every Sunday, my grandfather would go out in the chicken coop, grab one of the chickens, chop its head off, and that's what we had for Sunday dinner. There also was Joe's Restaurant, which is gone now. It was on the corner of 10th and Perry Street. And that was a gathering place for especially these immigrant men, because they could do things that they were familiar with in Italy. And my grandfather would take me over there from time to time. I loved going over there for any number of reasons. One of them is I liked watching these men play bocce, and they were very good at it. I never was able to master that game, but these guys they knew what they were doing. And they played for a little money. The other game that they played was More, and that's the one with the fingers. And I would sit hours watching those guys, and as long as they were doing was sitting there throwing their fingers out. But they didn't say the numbers, they sang them. And some of these guys had beautiful voices. And it just would come out, say-ee, and they'd go on, and they'd go on for hours. And I'd sit there and watch them, and it was very interesting to see these guys operate. They didn't play for about 50 cents a hand. Well, actually 50 cents a hand in those days, that's a lot of money, and when they were doing that. The other thing is Joe's Restaurant. Well, you wanted good food. That was the place to go. It was always good, especially the pizza. One day, I used to teach school up at Odessa, and one day, this was shortly after Pizza Hut opened, and the kids were saying, "Oh boy, we're going to go down to Pizza Hut." And I said, "Well, you don't know. You don't know what pizza is until you've had it made by Grace Caccarini." So, or Izzy Barber or Celia DiNardo. Those ladies knew what they were doing. My Aunt Celia would make for me every Christmas. She would make for me eggplant parmesan. Now, I don't care for eggplant parmesan except what she made. And boy, was it good. And now, my father refused under any circumstances to eat pasta fazool. Said he had enough of it when he was growing up and he wouldn't eat it again. Never again. He never ate it. Well, of course, you know what he's missing. That stuff is really good. But he wouldn't eat it. He just, no, I don't want any. But now, Christmas time, they just, the food, it was everywhere. And of course, in those days, you had to fast on Christmas Eve. You don't have to do that anymore, but in those days, so if you're going to eat anything, you had to eat fish. And two of the delicacies were scungili And calamari, everybody knows what those are, don't you? Squigili is eel, and calamari is squid. I refuse, even today, I refuse to eat either one of them. All the rest of it I'd eat, but not that. But what was the big thing? You people familiar with the different kinds of Italian cookies?
Yeah.
I mean, not the ones you go buy in the store. I mean the real thing. My mother would start making them right after Thanksgiving, and it would be a continuous thing right up until Christmas. The S cookies, you know what I'm talking about? The S cookies. Do you folks familiar with the Italian fried cookies? Do you know what I'm talking about? Sometimes they're called, oh, great.
Tied in the bowl?
Yeah, the ones that are twisted. Yeah, they're fried. We always call them fried. There's an official name for them. All right. I'll think of it on the way home. But anyway, my mother was, boy, she had a real knack for that. And we had people coming from different things to get those cookies from her. If you did it right, if you wanted to sell them, you'd have to sell them for something like $25 or $30 a pound. That's how rich they are. But boy, are they good. And she taught my wife how to make them. And my wife was able to make them as good as my mother. But we haven't made them. She was teaching my granddaughter to make them. But we haven't done that in about 6 or 7 years. So, I don't know if you remember my friend Vinical Forboni, young Vinical, every Christmas he would show up at the door with a bottle of wine, and the first words out of his mouth is, "Where's my cookies?" So. I lost my train of thought there. My grandfather worked at Watkins Salt from about 1910. He had gotten a job up in Phoenix, New York, around 1910. And he and his wife, my grandmother, and their 2 sons, my father and my Uncle Frank, he went up to take the job in a horse and buggy in February, if you can imagine. But anyway, he only stayed there for a couple of months because the jobs opened up at the salt company, so he came back and went to work as a fireman. And from that time until he retired in the mid-1950s, he shoveled coal. And his hands were black, no matter how much he washed them. And he wore gloves, of course, but no matter how much he washed them, they just stayed black. He worked hard all of his life. And after work, he'd come home. They walked to work in the morning, walk home for lunch, walk back to work, and you'd hear the whistle blow. The whistle would blow at 5 minutes to 7, then blow again at 7 o'clock, then blow again at noon, and then come home, then blow again at 5 minutes to 1, and then again at 1 o'clock, and then again at 4:30. They'd come home at 4:30, and the whistle would blow again. And he'd come home, and usually his friend from across the street down Marceline would come with him, and they'd sit down in the kitchen, and they'd get out a bottle of Dago Red and relax and have a glass of Dago Red. Now, whenever I drink red wine, I put ice in it, and everybody said, "But you can't do that, you can't do that." Well, yes, I can, because my grandfather, whenever, Mr. Marchini, whenever they drank that thing, they cut it with water, because if they didn't, it'd kill them. And of course, if I was there, they always handed me a glass. Here, have some wine. So that's how I got you. So now, whenever I drink red wine, I have to cut it with water. It's just the tradition. So, and that's how they relaxed. One of the great problems that I find with all of this is my own failure to pay attention to what the heck was going on around me. It was just part of my life, and what they were doing, it was just part of life. And I really wasn't paying an awful lot of attention. You know, I knew what was going on. I understood all of it. But I didn't record it, and I should have been. And when I finally figured it out, most of those people were gone. And I couldn't sit down and ask them the questions. What did you do in Italy? How did you get here? You know, all the, I know the general part of it, but I don't know the details. And that's the big failure of my generation, is not finding out. My father's generation, they weren't interested in that at all. They just, that was just part of what was going on, and they weren't interested. I'd ask my father questions, and usually the answer I got is that you don't need to know that. You don't want to know that. And the same with my uncles, both here and in Auburn. I'd ask them, no, you don't, no, you don't need to. No, I don't remember. That was the big thing. I don't remember. I did get a lot more out of my aunts from time to time. Especially my aunts in Auburn would tell me some of the stories. But still, it's very, my understanding of the whole thing, very, very spotty. So, anyway, it was a wonderful thing to have been able to grow up in the midst of all those people. And to say that I miss them would be an understatement. And I thank my grandparents, all four of them, almost every time I'm in church, that they had the good sense to come to this country and stay here. Now, there's one more thing that I want to mention. And that is, how did I handle those guys that called me a wop? Most of the time, I tell my mother, and my mother say, well, they did. But I got an answer, and I can't remember where I got it. I can't remember whether it was one of my uncles that told me, or I got it from over at St. Bonaventure. It could have been one of the priests. that told me how to answer them. And they said, well, you know, here's how you answer them. If they call, just tell them, yeah, when my ancestors ruled the world, yours lived in mud huts. And that stopped them cold. And now, I was up at the golf course one day, and there were a group of us playing, a couple of Italian descent. Now, this was all done in fun. Nobody was serious. But one of the guys was giving another one a hard time about his Italian ancestry, so I told him to tell him that. Next time he did it, to tell him that. And I asked him when I saw him, I said, shut him right up. Never mentioned it again. So, the other thing that the priest told me at the same time, he said, you know, it was the Italian Renaissance. It wasn't the French Renaissance. It wasn't the English Renaissance. It wasn't the Spanish Renaissance. It was the Italian Renaissance. The origins of the modern world begin in Italy in the 13th and 14th century. And you pick up any history book and you'll find that out. So that's the source of the world that we live in today. Arises out of the Italian Renaissance in the Quattrocento, 14th century. They did it all. Also, if you look at our government, we have a republic. It is stemmed directly from the Roman Republic. Those guys, we give these, what we call them our founding fathers. Where did they get those ideas? Well, they went back to the Roman Republic and got the ideas. Our legislative body, what is it called? The Senate. Well, it comes directly from the Roman Senate. In New York State, we have the Senate and the Assembly. That was the other body in Rome, the Assembly. So we are steeped in the history of Italy in this country. If you go to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., what do you see? You see a classical Roman, Greco-Roman architecture crowned by a dome. That's a Roman dome. It's the Romans who created that thing. It's patterned after the dome on St. Peter's. Actually, the dome at the Capitol building will fit 2.5 times inside the dome of St. Peter's. If you've ever been there, it's quite an edifice. So there is a great deal that those of us who are of Italian extraction can be proud of. And a great deal of it that exists in this country even at the present time. So, buongiorno. Grazie. Does anybody want to ask a question? I don't know if I can answer it, but I'd love to try. Yes? I can't see anybody.
So, couple actually. Number one, my father, so tell me, is there any truth to this? My father used to tell a story that the Italians actually segregated along the creek, and that the southern Italians mainly lived on the south side, and the northern Italians mainly lived on the north side.
Probably, yeah. Well, in where my grandparents lived were mostly Calabres, yeah. Yeah, that area, were mostly Calabres, up in Salt Point. They were probably more than, not that far, much farther north. There's not that many, most everybody came from south of Rome.
There are Emilio Romanos on Salt Point. Right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just northeast of Rome.
Well, yeah, well, look, the farther up the peninsula you go, the higher up you are. The farther down, you know, us southern boys, you know, and Calabres, there was only one other group of people who were further down than us, the Sicilian. Oh, he's Sicilian, you know.
And the other question was just, I'm a little bit surprised you didn't mention that once upon a time we had I remember just the tail end of it, but we had a very active Sons of Italy club, and especially Angelo Bartolomew's quartets.
Yeah, I didn't know. It just slipped my mind. My father wasn't involved up there. Consequently, we didn't do much up that way. My father was involved in the American Legion, and which was run by the Italians and the Irish. Well, yeah. Well, most, you know, the largest group of veterans were of Italian descent, and so, you know. The other thing I didn't mention: how many of you are familiar with Glen Creek? Well, we owned Glen Creek. And the only people who played in there were kids of Italian descent. Nobody else came in there. Now, we didn't chase anybody out, but for whatever reason, we owned the creek. And in those days, it was the Green Bridge to the Black Bridge. We owned it. And in the wintertime, we ice skated, and in the summertime, well, there's all kinds of things going on down there.
Hey Jim, do you know anything? My dad told a story that it may not have been directly related to the Italians, but it must have been a 4th of July or a Decoration Day or something like that. He said the Ku Klux Klan came into town and were, you know, from their horses, telling people to salute the flag, and someone pulled out a pistol and said, "You get off that horse and you shoot the flag," or something like that. Do you know anything about that?
No, that's a new one. I know the Klan was active here,
Yeah.
but I'd never heard that story.
The fellow with the pistol was a Hoy, according to him. Irish. But I'm sure because they were so anti-Catholic, so I'm
Yeah.
sure the Italian thing played into it. But you don't know anything about
Well,
this?
you know, at first, the relation between the Italians and the Irish were a little rough at first, but that broke down rather quickly, especially as that second generation, and especially after World War II. Those fellas coming back from World War II, they wouldn't put up with any of that nonsense. And the interchange, the exchange after World War II between the Irish and the Italians became a lot more frequent. A lot, you know, Irish men marrying Italian girls, or Irish girls are marrying Italian men. That happened a lot more frequently. So that whole business broke down entirely. That didn't stop the Irish and the Italians from making fun of one another. They did that with a great deal of gusto, but it was all in fun. And I can remember especially, I don't see you. I know you people probably don't remember the softball games, but we used to play. They used to play. These were the fellas that came home from World War II, and one of the first things they wanted to do was play baseball. And so they had a softball league, and we used to play over. We used to play over under the lights, next to the county barns, where it's right where Tops is now, right exactly where Tops is now, and you know those guys that go at it, and there were two teams, both. One was the Garden Grill, and that was owned by Leo Martin, and the other one was the Tap Room, and that was owned by Bob Martin. and they were brothers, and it was war between those two teams. It was war on the field. Once the game was over with, they were buddies again. But on the field, boy, no quarter. They gave no quarter. And if you wanted to see baseball, pure American baseball, that was the place to see it, because it was pure American baseball.
They were great games.
Oh, wonderful games. I mean, that's what, there was no quarter given, and
And those barns were owned by Mateo Martin
yeah.
until he passed away.
Yeah. Well, after they went at it. I can remember pitching duel between Nick Colonial, Blackie Colonial, and Billy Sherrock, Horsey. That was his nickname, Horsey. And they'd go at it, a real pitcher's duel, and they were exciting and big crowds. They had bleachers. They had bleachers there, and the bleachers were always full. Whenever these two teams played, they were always full. So, and that was part of what they were doing.
Any other
Yeah.
Frank?
questions?
Jimmy, you forgot to tell the athletic ability of all your uncles and your dad and all that.
Well, no, that not.
They were really good.
Yeah, yeah. My Uncle George was he was the captain of the football team in 1940.
Yeah, my godfather.
Yeah, he was the captain of the football team.
Yeah, they were all that way.
So, but if you look at I have a photograph when he was the captain, and you look at, and I got the names, and half of them were either of Italian or Irish descent. So.
Yeah, little Joe was a barrel jumper down the creek. You know that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 4'10", 110 pounds, something like that. He was something.
So that's a great segue. At this time, I would like to thank you very much, Jim. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for putting up with me for all that time.
But I'd also like at this time to invite you all to share some stories. And the first one is a setup. I arranged this ahead of time. Pat Hastings.
You don't have to say that. Okay, great. Just a story from your Italian family past. Just one, though, Pat. I know you have many.
I can't, it doesn't work.
No, it's fine, it's working. It is working. It is working. Yeah, it's working. Just talk right now.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in Elmira, by the way, but I spent a lot of time in Watkins Glen, especially when I was a teenager, because the kids here had more fun than we did in Illinois. But I remember my mother always told us the story of the family, and my grandmother was 15 when my grandfather fell in love with her in Italy. And I guess back then girls got married at 15, but he was in a higher class than she was because he was a carpenter. And his family refused to allow him to marry her because she was a farm girl. And that's the lowest, at that time, that was the lowest class. And so when they came to Italy to hire people for the railroad, he figured that was a way out. So they got married in Italy, and he left for this country to send back for her. But there was so much sadness in their families that the hardships were difficult. And I remember my mother telling me there were two sisters, and besides my mother here, their name was Spirido. And one was married to a Franzese, and the other one was married to a Rondinero. And in those days, if an Italian man here wanted a wife and they asked somebody if they had somebody in Italy that would come, the girls would make the choice whether they wanted to be here or not. And because most of them wanted to get out of Italy, they left. So my mother's aunt, Carolyn, came, being promised to an Italian man in Watkins. And when she got here, she went to work at the salt works, and she fell in love with an Irishman. And she refused to marry this Italian man because he was mean. So when she was coming out of work, my Aunt Lucy was a little girl, and she used to walk down to the salt plant to meet her. And while they were starting to come by, this Italian man came up with a knife and cut her face all up. Oh. He said, if you're not going to marry me, you're not marrying anybody. And they brought her home to my grandmother's house, and by the time the doctor got there, she had bled to death. So that was one sadness in the family. Then my grandmother used to walk to Watkins to get her groceries, and she'd take 2 or 3 kids with her to help her carry things. And then, but she always had to get dressed up to go to Watkins. And then she would come home and put the groceries on the table and go up and change her clothes back. And while she was gone, the 2 of the little girls, most of them were my aunts, went through the groceries to look for things. And they found a jar of jelly. They thought it was jelly. They put it on bread and they ate it. Well, when my grandmother came down, she said, "Who opened that jar?" "Well, we made a sandwich." "Well, that's rat poison." My one aunt survived, the other one died. She was 7 years old. So they had so much unhappiness along with all of the things that happened to them. But they were full of love and they were full of happiness. And you just, when you came to Watkins Glen, like I did as a kid, I thought that was heaven. You know, it just, I can remember that my cousins, we all had a cousins club, and we would go up on my aunt and uncle's farm and build a big bonfire and eat and talk and laugh and sing. And 4 of my men cousins decided they were going to entertain us, and they went in the house and dressed in my girl cousin's clothes and came out and danced for us. And I see Anna Jean. I took my 2 grandsons there for a brush cut to Jean the barber. He said, Pat, I have to tell you that your grandmother was a saint. I said, really? She died very young and in her 50s. But he said whenever people came from Italy and they didn't have any money and they needed a place to stay, they stayed with her till they got the job and found a place of their own. And she did that for everybody. And when he said, when I came, he'd come with his son. Came with his father. Well, he was the son then. Okay. He said, your grandmother used to send one of the kids down and make us come to Sunday dinner because we were alone. And I've heard all these beautiful stories about the family. But the one thing about my grandfather was he gave all the grandchildren that were boys quarters, wrapped it in their net, in their end of their hanky, and so they wouldn't lose it. But the girls didn't get anything. But anyway, I think that people who come from Italian heritage have one of the greatest gifts in the world, and that's the tremendous amount of love that is given.
Thank you. Mark, you can just pass that down to Mark. Mark Randonauer.
So I want to just add one little bit of a footnote to what Pat was saying. It's tied into the same story. It gives a little bit more of the culture. Because when my grandfather came over here, which was around 1905, he was looking for, he had been in New York City, but came up here, was looking for a wife. And so he got to know everybody, and he became very enamored of one of the Franzese girls, who later became, I had her name a second ago, Caccarini. One generation older than that. I'll get Lena Caccarini. Okay, so he went to her father to ask for her hand, and he said, no, you cannot marry her because her older aunt is still unmarried. And so that's how Maria Spirito became a Randonauer.
I see a lot of familiar faces. My name's Judd Spina. The story I'll tell is really a variation on what's already been said, and it's probably something you all will say the same sort of thing. My grandparents, the Spinas, lived on 2nd Street, and my other grandparents, the Burrills, lived on 9th Street. And my great-grandparents, the Paradisos, lived on 3rd Street. And my mother had 7 sisters, my father and my brother, and all the cousins.
That mic's not on, Joe.
Okay, well, there we go. So back up, Spina's on 2nd Street, Burrills on 9th Street, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents in between on 3rd. And all the cousins, virtually all the cousins, lived between 2nd and 9th Street. And the thing I remember is, I'll try to keep this quick, but these days when you plan a birthday party, you have to do all this planning. But then when you had a birthday party, it's your birthday and all the cousins. And that was that, cake and ice cream, and there was no gift bags and none of that stuff. Everybody brought you a little present, and it was just an automatic. Similarly, on the holidays, we would generally go to one side of grandparents or the other, but the immediate families had the celebration, but in all that time they're preparing, all of the more extended family would be stopping by left and right. My dad's cousins or his aunts and uncles and those folks. So, there weren't invitations, there weren't all that stuff. It just all happened. So, It's, we've moved away now, and so many have, and that sort of thing is, I think, rare. But that's just another aspect of the story.
Thank you. And introduce yourself, please.
My name's Tony Campese, was Campese, got changed, like a lot of them probably. I was gonna, Jeff brought up something earlier about the Ku Klux Klan that had been very active in the area here. My father told me a story one time about that particular incident that he's talking about. And it went something like this. The Italians had their own gangs, if you want to call them that. And the Irish also did. And somehow they made contact with this Irish gang also, because most of them were Catholic too. So they kind of waited for this Ku Klux Klan group to come marching through town. And this was my father said this was the first time that they ever kind of band together, the Irishmen and the Italians. And they started fighting these Klan guys and ripping hoods off and so on. Well, they got this leader, wizard guy, whatever the term is. They ripped his hood off, and it turned out to be some prominent guy from Burdett, who was now suddenly exposed. His identity was exposed. And my father he started laughing. He said, it wasn't long after this guy and his family moved out of the area. And it was because of that. And he also, and I remember him and my Uncle Jimmy were sitting there talking. We'd have these family get-together. Somebody make pizza and somebody bring wine and beer and stuff. And my Uncle Jimmy said that after that, he said, you didn't see any more of the Klan come marching through town anymore. So that kind of changed history a little there. The other thing I was going to ask Jim about, and maybe you could talk about some of the name changing part that went on. Like Scapatura and Campese changed to something else.
Probably most of Johnny Frank gave me a nice piece the other day that I found very interesting, and of course I already knew Johnny Frank's forebears were actually named Pompeo. John, did I get that right?
You got it right.
Yeah, and there's an explanation on that sheet of how that changed. Probably almost everyone that came here, probably to some degree or other, had their name changed for whatever reason, because somebody couldn't pronounce it. I get telephone calls, and somebody will try to pronounce my name, and Lord knows, but that's always an easy answer. There's nobody here by that name. That takes care of it. Judd?
Well, I was just going to quickly, aren't the Richardsons and the Raccasanos? Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but it was, it was easier to change to Richardson.
Yeah.
We had a priest here, I don't know if you remember, his name was Neil Miller. Well, his name was really Mediero, not Miller. And his father did that because he didn't want his son to have problems, so he changed it to Miller. So.
Jim, my understanding is that oftentimes that happened because the babies were born at home. and then the doctor came and did the paperwork. And our people were illiterate.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so, well, what's your name? And so Rachasano becomes Richardson.
Yeah. Yeah. It just happened, you know, like ours got changed in school. So,
Hi, my name is Lita Biagetti, actually it's Lita Biagetti Friedlander. I'm on the Salt Point end of the Italians. My father is Frank Biagetti and my mother is Nicolina Franzese Biagetti. And one of the stories, my mother's mother is Roma Franzese, Roma Fraboni Franzese. And they were all Italian immigrants together. The Frabonis and the Biagettis were from the same town in Italy. In a little bit farther north, it's called the region of Marche. The town is called Arcevia. And I just buried my father's oldest sister, Mary Bora. She was 104 in January this year. Some of you may have known my sister Roseanne Doan, Roseanne Biagetti Doan, a big part of the family here. One of the things that I found fascinating about our family was entrepreneurship. My grandfather was one of the founders of D&T Franzese Brothers. His brother Dominic, his oldest brother Dominic, and they were road construction people who built most of Route 14 and 414 and this northern western section of Route 17. He also had a good part of building and repairing the racetrack. And the other side of my grandfather, Tony Franzese's family, of which he came from 13 siblings, one of which died at 2 years old, drowning on the farm in the water barrels. But my mother had, I think, hundreds of cousins. Mark is my cousin. Dinah Richardson is a cousin. I think Pat somehow is related at some point. And then Joe Franzese, Helen and Joe Franzese founded the Glen Motor Inn. So Italians had a really big part of the business community here, and the Glen Chevrolet as well. One of the things about changing the name, my grandmother married into the Franzese family, and at the time their last name was Frank, and they owned grape vineyards all the way up where the Glen Motor Inn now is, all the way up north to Monty Stamp's property, Lakewood. And they owned the golf course. And so this was my mother's father's father, and his last name was Frank. And my grandmother, Roma, married my grandfather, Anthony, at 17 years old. And but she went from a Fraboni to a Frank. She didn't like that. She didn't want to have anything to do with being a Frank. Well, that was just part of who she was, not to be any of you that are named Frank. But anyway, she went and gathered everyone's passports and personal identification. She got 25 Franks back to Franzese. She went down to Ellis Island, did all the paperwork. She was 18 years old. So all the Franzese families that you know here went back to their original name because of what Roma Franzese did. And then she went on to raise her kids and be a seamstress in the town, and many of you probably remember who she was.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, come on. You all have a story.
Yes, my name is Carlos Urashi. My family owned a dairy farm on Route 414 on the way to Corning. It was my grandfather, Elio, and my father was Ernest, and my uncle was Dominic. I left the community about 50 years ago and lived in Ithaca, but my heart has never left the community. I come back frequently. One of my favorite recollections was when we were growing up, whenever we were dealing with my grandparents, they always spoke to us in English. But when we were working around the farm, and my uncle and my dad and my grandfather were working, they always communicated with each other in Italian. Except when something went wrong. They'd be rattling along in Italian, of course I didn't understand any of it, and then all of a sudden something wrong happened and they would swear in English. And I actually grew up thinking that there weren't any curse words in the Italian language. I found out later that indeed is not the case. One of the things that I came to appreciate many years later was the fact that I didn't take advantage of that communication that they were having between each other and make a better effort to try to comprehend and understand the Italian language. But I came to realize that part of that whole thing that I didn't realize at the time, they were trying to Americanize the family. It's my generation that suddenly got an interest in going back and finding out some of this heritage, and as Jim had already mentioned, sometimes that was too late to ask the questions because the people were gone. By the way, we were part of the Arcadia gang, came from that part of Italy, and both the Biagettis and Segreci's, fortunately some of us have been back. I actually saw where my grandfather and my grandmother were both born, and I have a cousin over there that we've communicated with, so we've been able to put some of the pieces together, but not as much. It would have been a lot easier if we started a lot earlier.
Hi, my name is Barbara Martine. Leo Martine and Jenny Simeon were my parents. First of all, hi Pete. I want to thank Glenda and Jean because I have learned so much from this display at the Historical Society. If you've not gone, please go. I was one of the people crying in the room that Glenda was talking about. When my dad passed away, I was only 20 years old, and I realized now how young I was. I felt like an old lady at that time, but I was not. And the cemetery, my family's in the old cemetery, and the Martins and the Simeons are next to each other. And I never could figure out how that happened. Like, how are they literally right next to each other? And in front of them was a family named Pecoraro. I don't know anybody from that family, but when my dad died, I used to go up there every day and have lunch. I'd stop at Mr. Chicken, and then I'd go up and I'd have lunch with my dad. So I made a pact with Albert Pecoraro that I would help take care of all of his plots and all of his people if I could sit and lean against his headstone while I was visiting with my dad. Well, of course he said yes. So I did that for a really long time. Did not know until a few weeks ago when I went to the display and I was looking at the map, and it's hard for me to even think about it right now. I found the Martins and I found the Simeons, and the Pecoraros were right there with them. So in my head, I'm thinking of how did they do this? And now, listening to everybody here, listening to Jim, talking with Glenda, and looking at the display, they did stay together. They came over here and they stayed together. So they bought plots like that. So the Martins and the Simeons, even though they weren't married to each other at that point, did that, and then the Pecoraros. So please do yourself a favor. I happen to be a baby cousin. I'm Patty's baby cousin. This is my baby nephew over here. So there was a lot for us in my generation, because like everybody said here, our families were so proud. We can't speak Italian, and they didn't talk a lot about what was going on. They really wanted us to be American, and they did it, and they did a good job. But the pride I have after seeing that display is just magnified. So please go if you haven't, and thank you again, everybody at the Historical Society that participated.
Thanks, Barb. And this is a good time to introduce Jeannie Gardner. You have to stand up. Sorry. She did it all. She designed it and organized it.
And I'm sorry if I made any mistakes. My head was spinning. And I'm a Belagati, which was from Northern Saludicchio. So, but we have our own biangos and they came over together. But my goal now, I retired, and I can't sit still, my brain's always going. So my goal for the Historical Society is to collect as many stories as we can. You all have folders, family folders down there, and those stories go in the folders so that when our kids finally realize they should have asked us, they will know. So anything you want to contribute, we will put in the folders. You can write it out, email us. We're going to have, the 19th Amendment was ratified, so next year I think it's like in March, about Women's Month. We'll be doing that, and I'm going to be asking for stories about strong women from Schuyler County during that period of time. Then it's the end of World War II. We're going to be doing an exhibit. I'm going to be collecting pictures and stories from the people who served in World War II. After the exhibits come down, all those will go in your family folders, so please help me. And I hate talking in public.
And this is a good time to mention that about 20 minutes or so after we finally close here this afternoon, I'll be back down at the museum, and I'll be open until 6. The museum will be open until 6, so you're all pumped. Come on down, check out the exhibit. It's in place until October 31st.
That was my question. How long?
Yeah, October 31st. Okay?
This is just a thought. I know the story I put together on my grandfather's family was 3 or 4 pages long, and obviously had to be pared down to fit in the exhibit. Is there any way, and probably other stories were too, so is there any way to compile that and post it on the Historical Society website, all of the unedited stories?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. It could be easily done, with the technology we have. Time is an issue, but I'm recruiting volunteers.
Someone
Yes,
more
that's
skilled at that than
Good idea.
me.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Thanks.
So more stories.
So, Linda, some of these stories you're going to put in your folders if you break out them off, is that it?
Yes, yes. So Patty's asking what Jeannie meant, and just like Jeannie said, if you write it up, if you send an email, we'll put it in these so-called family folders. And Miranda from the high school, say hi. She has been recording everything today. So it's really a great leap as far as oral history for us to have all this recorded. All your stories that you've told and what Jim has told us. Introduce yourself.
So I'm Frank Spina Jr., and my great-grandfather would have been Frank Spina, and would have been J.D.'s grandfather as well. And so I just, we talked about being an American and everything, and my grandfather, when he came here in the early 1900s, that was it. He was an American from that point on, and never had any interest in going back to Italy. And a lot of that had to do with how poor they were. Jim talked about them being farmers over there. And my Uncle Jim, Jeff's father, told me that my grandfather Frank, he had a recollection of every time they ever had meat when he was growing up, because it was such a rarity that they had the opportunity. And he even talked about when he was a kid, him and a couple of his brothers, there was flooding going on. And they were passing a farm, and they drowned a sheep in a creek, and they took it to the farmer. They didn't tell the farmer that they just told the farmer that they found it, and the farmer gave them some meat. That's how desperate they were to try and get their hands on meat. And so Later on in his life, when he had the chance to go back to Italy, he had friends that were going to go back to Italy and just be tourists and see the country, and they offered to take him with them. And he said, no way. He said, I didn't leave anything back, but there's no reason for me to go back and see it. So that was a lot of the mentality of the Italian immigrants, that they were most certainly Americans.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
Frank Spina Senior.
I have to hold it up.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
It's on you.
it's still on, okay. I'm very proud of a lot of these relatives that we had. They were really fantastic athletes, some of them. Very proud of that. And I want to mention something that my father told me about. Jimmy Skepter's father's brother, Jimmy Skepter, was my neighbor for years. Grew up right next to me, and my dad told me how great of a boxer he was, and I was always so proud of him, but I never knew that till I got older. And my dad said, of course his father was Rocco, and his sister was my mother. And I used to see him look out my back window, and he'd be on the picnic table doing squat thrusts with one leg, and the other leg straight out. But anyways, my dad told me he was runner-up in the New York State Golden Glove Championship, boxing championship, and the only reason he was runner-up is because one shot, when he hit the guy, he broke his hand. So my father said that he was going to turn pro after that, and a lot of those guys boxed back then in the Elks Club, and Jimmy did too, and nobody could touch him. Of course, nobody any place could touch him, and nobody messed with him either because he'd finish you off. So, I mean, in one way, one shot and it was over, you know, knocked the guy right out. And there's plenty of that went on in the Jefferson Hotel because they picked on him. They called him WAP, and that was the last thing they ever said for a long time. And, but anyway, my dad told me that he was great, and if he went on to be pro, he thinks he would have been world champ. That's how good Jimmy was. And I'm just real proud of that because he was a fantastic athlete. And there were 6 of them all together. My mother had 6 brothers, and they were all real good athletes in one way or another. Like I mentioned, little Joe, he would be down on they said the Italians owned the creek. Yeah, I think he owned it too because my mother told me he'd be down there jumping barrels on his skates. So ice skating. And they were real little guys. They were all about my size mostly, except for my godfather, Uncle George. And I didn't know till Jimmy said it that he was captain of the football team. The only thing he ever said to me is he liked to play basketball, and that's all he said. Them guys never said much about themselves at all, but I just want people to know about that. And most of those skepters, a lot of them skepters are business people too, so that's in me, and it comes from the Paradisos also, and maybe from the Spinas, but the Spinas, most of the Spinas are up in Geneva and Rochester, and I'm the only one left in Watkins Glen because they're all dead. I mean, they're dead, the ones that are around here. Jud's dad and my father were brothers, and of course they're gone, and my dad was a real good boxer too. Tony Ferry told me some stories about him, but he was just quicker than grease lightning, so that was really something. I get some of that from him and Uncle Jimmy, I think. Anyway, it's just fun talking about those guys, and I wanted to pass that along, so that's it, man.
Barbara already called me out as a Martine, so I didn't grow up in Watkins. I grew up in Sarah with my dad, Leo, and his father was Leo Martine of the Garden Grove fame. And the story's mainly for you. You said your last name was Belagati. Having grown up in Sarah, I spent a lot of time at the lake with my grandfather, and those were pretty much the best times of my childhood, fishing and listening to him and my relatives and all the stories. So my wife and I moved to Lancaster in '93, and we vacationed on the lake every year pretty much since then, and we now live in Lodi on the lake. We bought a cottage, which is absolutely cool. But anyway, we were up on vacation about, I would say, probably 12 to 13 years ago, and there was an older guy next door. And throughout the week, we said hi to each other a few times, and towards the end of the week, he said, "Hey, you want to come on over and have a beer?" And I said, "This Pope's still wearing a funny hat." So I went over and had a beer with this guy, and he's like, "What's your last name?" And I said, "It's Martine." He said, "Son of a," and you guys can figure out the rest of that. But I sat with Gus Belagati for about 2 hours, and we told stories, and he told me stories about my grandfather that just spun my head. So that was absolutely really cool. He gave me 2 bottles of his homemade wine, and we were fast friends.
Did you?
So that's the story.
Wine will kill you. All right, my name is Patty Simmons, and I was just thinking about what to say, and I might as well get in on the name change thing. My grandfather could read and write in Italian, so our last name is spelled correctly. It's Schimizzi. Where did Skimmets come from? You know, so anywhere outside of Schuyler County, if you happen to bump into me, you may get reintroduced to me as Patty Schimizzi. But in Watkins, they are very hesitant to change. And it's Skimmets or nothing. So, and also, I'm talking about entrepreneurs, my grandfather owned almost a whole block on 10th Street where the Scapturas were there, and he had property enough to give to his oldest daughter, which is Anna Jean's mom, and he just had a lot of property back there with goats and the chickens and the apple cider press and the barn and this and that. Then he had the idea to buy a building on 4th Street, and he waited until his sons came home from World War II, and that's where Sammy's Grill came from. And actually was a partnership between my uncle Max and my father, but Max's Grill didn't sound as good as Sammy's Grill. So my grandfather owned it until my father bought it after my grandfather passed away and my parents got married. And we had it in the family from approximately 1942 until my dad passed away in 1970, and we sold it in 71. So that's that.
Not there anymore.
Not there anymore.
Hi, my name is Pete Nasia, and I was born in '41, but I have great memories of Watkins, primarily because of people that I've heard speak today. I've got spiritual blood in me. I've got some Martine blood in me. I've got Nasia blood in me, and I've got Belagati blood in me. And as a child, I remember coming to Watkins with my grandfather and my other relatives from Elmira, because my grandfather came from Italy, and I think Mr. Frank sponsored him as a sponsor, Pasquale Nasia, and he came to Watkins because of the salt plant and the jobs that were available here. And he married a Martino girl, Lucy Martine, which was one of Patty's aunts and Barbara's uncle. And the thing that I remember about coming to Watkins, several things, but the reunions were something special. Every year for about 50 years, from 1949 onward, I can remember coming to Watkins and going to a place on Salt Point Road that was an Italian-American club.
Sons of Italy.
And all of these people coming together from everywhere. And they were all related somehow. And the people and the way they shared feelings for each other and the music and the food was just unbelievable. And that one day every 50 years was something I really remember more than anything else. It was the people and the feeling of community and just being part of that has been really important to me, and hearing everybody talk about it and their own families and their own relationships with the community of Watkins Glen. That's been special to me.
I'm just going to lighten it back up. At our family reunion this year, my cousin Ronald, which it was Menoncello, Beligati, Spirito, he said he would never date in Watkins Glen because he didn't know who was related to him. Did
you all hear that? Mark, why don't you be our concluding story?
Okay. Well, just want to give one more humorous one, and this is a story my dad told. My dad had just returned from World War II after VE Day, and so he was here for VJ Day, and it was a huge celebration, and he got himself blisteringly drunk. But the story is that he was sitting on the porch with my Uncle Lou Purcelli. So that was the Rochester branch that married Lena Rondinaro, and my grandfather. And their celebration for VJ Day was drinking the Dago Red and reciting the entirety of the Latin High Mass. My grandfather sang the priest parts, and my uncle sang all of the congregation parts. So that's the celebration for VJ Day.
Adopted Italian, right, Duke? And I'm very proud of that. So again, thank you, Jim. It was wonderful sharing your stories and the knowledge, the facts, the background. Thanks to Jean for the exhibit, and you for helping her. And Miranda, thank you for recording this for posterity. So again, give me about 20 minutes or so to get down to the Brick Tavern Museum, and I'll be there till 6. If you're all psyched, come on down, check it out.
If anybody's interested, there were lace cookies.